Well, good morning.
Good morning.
I want to warn you today.
Uh-oh.
The warning is this. I'm going to ask 3 very convicting questions.
I will
heard,
not tell my hair
bring
color.
it. So, I love that. And what I want you to do with these 3 questions when I ask them, they'll be at different times during us walking through this next passage, Philippians 1:12 through 26. I really am not looking for you to answer them out loud. I'm looking for you to take them to heart, to ask yourself these questions, and really begin to wrestle with these with the Lord. But in order for me to launch into this appropriately, I need to tell you a quick story. Some of you heard this story years and years and years ago, actually very shortly after it happened. Melissa and I were living in the woodlands. You may or may not know that we have had little cordon bleu finch birds that we have had as a part of our lives over the course of time. We've had several of them. They only last about 7 to 10 years, so we've had a number of them. This one, in particular, his name was Blue, B-L-E-U. We were putting him in his new cage. Our oldest son at the time, Ryan, was about 16. Our youngest son, Sean, was about, maybe 11. They're now 38 and 33. Ryan has given me the approval to tell this story, and he may be sorry for that because I've told it so many times. His responsibility in house cleaning was he was supposed to clean the cage. So his responsibility was to clean Blue's cage. And on this particular morning, we're up, we're cleaning the house. His chore was to clean the cage, and we gave him the appropriate tools with which to clean the cage. He had a little toothbrush to clean the corners. He had, alcohol wipes to clean it and kind of disinfect the bottom of the cage. And he had an Oric handheld vacuum cleaner. These are the kind that they used to advertise that this little vacuum cleaner could suck a bowling ball and hold it. So he launches into cleaning the cage. I love this. Just the groans are hysterical.
We know what's coming.
We can imagine.
We go off, Melissa and I go off in another room to clean, and we hear this click, which is the vacuum cleaner.
Yeah.
And then we heard this. And then we heard this. Ah! We came running in, and he is holding the nozzle of the Oric vacuum cleaner. And in 16-year-old logic mentality, he said this to us. He ran in there. Well, what became really obvious was the crevice attachment was not on the end of the nozzle.
Oh.
And as he was vacuuming out the inside, he sucked Blue right up into the bag. So we immediately rush into action. We're trying to calm Ryan down. Melissa is between that hysterical laughter and hysteric over my bird because I'm so sorry, my bird is in here. That's the funniest thing I've seen, but I'm so sorry. This is one that had the little bag, so we tear open the bag, and I've never seen so many feathers in all my life. We're pulling in these little feet begin to emerge from the bag, just like this. We pull him out, eyes are closed, feet are up like this, totally bald on the top of his head. Not a single feather, either from hitting the back of the bag or just sucking the feathers right off the top of his head. And Melissa, in this loving pastoral way, just begins to rub his stomach, and it must have been bird CPR because Blue's eyes fluttered open. She looked at him and she said, "Blue's alive!" Grabbed him, put him in the cage, and for a day, Blue did this. He didn't move, he didn't eat, he didn't drink, and he didn't sit up on a perch. He had no balance. He just was on the ground. We calmed Ryan down. We calmed all the rest of us down. Blue lived another couple of years. It was really kind of a miraculous thing. But it begs this question, what do you do when you've been sucked out of your secure cage by the vacuum cleaner of life and you find yourself in the bag? What do you do when you've been sucked out of that secure cage by the vacuum cleaner of life and you're in the bag? That's the situation that Paul finds himself in. And as we move to this next section, we're going to find this wonderful head, heart, hands employee of Paul's as he's talking to the church about now what we call the pursuit of the excellent things of God. If you remember, we talked in the first section about he's opening this letter up. We saw who first came into the church, how the church got started. And then we looked at the fact that Paul called us participants, partakers, provers. And then he worked into this beautiful prayer in which he said, very specifically, I pray that your love would abound all the more in discernment and knowledge, and that you would be able to prove the excellent things of God, resulting in fruits of righteousness. And it begs the question, what are those excellent things of God? Well, Paul's getting ready to tell us those. And the interesting thing is we're going to look at these excellent things of God. There are three of them, very distinctly. They come out in verses 12 through 14. And then Paul's going to reiterate them from a very difficult scenario. Paul's going to say, these are the three excellent things of God that you should be in pursuit of, even when you're in the vacuum cleaner bag, when you're in a prison in Rome, when you're under the weight of a tragedy, when you're in the midst of a difficult circumstance. This is still what we are to pursue. Now, Paul has a very different definition for excellence. The world says excellence is that you succeed, that you do it better than anybody else, that you're the king of the hill. That's excellence. Paul says excellence is the pursuit of what is important to God. That is the definition of excellence. It's the pursuit of what is important to God. And now he's going to unfold those three things that are important to God. I want to read 12 through 14, and we're going to unpack this a little bit. He starts this and says, but, because that's kind of this contrast to where he's been. He has been be filled with fruits of righteousness, which are by Christ to the glory and praise of God. But, and now he says, I want you to know. I want you to know. This is the head. This is that word epigenosis. I want you to experientially know. I want you to deeply know this, brothers, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, so that it's become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. And most of the brethren in the Lord have become confident by my chains and are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Where's Paul? And this is what he's writing to the church? Listen to the three things that are the pursuit of the important things of God. The first one comes in verse 12. But I want you to know beyond head knowledge, brothers, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. Here's the first thing, and it is the pursuit of the expansion of the gospel. Even when we find ourselves in difficult circumstances, is it perhaps truth that God has placed us in that difficult circumstance so that we can pursue the expansion of his kingdom? Maybe that's exactly the reason why we are in that situation. Now just think about this for a moment. Listen to what Paul says. He says, the things which have happened to me. Now, what two things do we know that have happened to Paul that might play into exactly where he is today? The first happened 10 years prior. And that was when he's in Philippi. He's put in prison. He has experience in prison. And if you're God and you're looking down and you're saying, I want the entire palace guard of Herod's palace and Caesar, I want them all to know, because I love them, I want them all to know the gospel. Let's see, who could I choose? Perhaps somebody who has experience in prison. So Paul says, my experience in the past of me being in a Philippian jail now has led me to being in a Roman jail. And he says to them this, the things that have happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. Now imagine you're the church in Philippi and you hear Paul's in a prison in Rome. What's your first expression? Oh, isn't that terrible? Paul's in prison in Rome, and yes, it is terrible because prison in Rome was a terrible place to be. But Paul expresses this to them. The reason I'm in a prison in Rome is because God said there's something more important. And the important thing of God is the expansion of the gospel, the furtherance of the gospel. Because does God love the Roman guards? Does he love the people in the household of Caesar?
Yes.
If you don't believe me, go back in the Old Testament to the book of Jonah and think about how God wanted the entire city of Nineveh, which was this horrible place, to know him. And his promise to Jonah was, if you bring them the word, I'm going to save them. And Jonah's response was, I don't want him to be saved. So here's Paul who has this really fantastic experience in a Philippian prison, and now he's put into a Roman prison. The expansion of the gospel, it's the furtherance of the gospel. And listen to what he says. He says, these things I want you to know, that the things which happened to me, now there's the heart, the full experience of what's happened to me, now goes to the furtherance of the gospel. Here's now the hand part of that. So I want you to know what's happened to me now furthers the gospel. There's the head, heart, hands expression. And that furtherance of the gospel is that a guard who was chained to him 24/7, round the clock. Can you imagine being a Roman guard and knowing you're going to have 8 hours being chained to Paul? Because you know they're talking to each other and they're saying, I'm going to be chained to Paul, and all I'm going to hear about is Jesus, 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 Jesus. And the answer is, amen, 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 amen. Because if Paul isn't the one that's there, how do they ever hear about the good news of Jesus Christ? So Paul says this is that first expression of what's important to God. And it's the expansion of the gospel. And here's that first convicting question. Am I expanding the gospel? Not looking for an answer, just looking for you to wrestle with it. Am I expanding? And maybe God has placed you in a very specific place and time for the purpose of not your comfort, but for the purpose of expanding the gospel, the purpose of an important thing of God. He's put you in touch with somebody, some way, some shape, somehow, some circumstance in which the important things of God are supposed to rise to the surface. Now you know why your love should be abounding more and more. Because he's saying your love is for the people that he's placed around you in the expansion of the gospel. The second one comes in verse 13. He says, so it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ. It's become evident to the entire palace guard. What's become evident to the entire palace guard? But what the gospel, Christ in specific, how has that become evident to them?
Because of what he says and what he does.
Because of Paul, right? Because of what he said and what he's done. Here's this statement he's making. It's become evident to the whole palace guard that I am a servant of Jesus Christ, that I am a slave of Christ, I am a bondservant of Christ. This is what's important. And all the rest, notice that it's not just the palace guard, but it's all the rest. It's everybody else. It's his friends, his enemies that are inside the palace that have now come to know it because Paul cannot keep his mouth closed about Jesus Christ. But it's interesting, Paul doesn't say here that it's become evident by my speech. He just says it's become evident. That Christ has become evident to the entire place. Why? Because of how he treats the guards. Think about his experience with the Philippian jailer. Don't kill yourself. We're all here. We've been beaten and whipped, but we're singing praises to God. This expression of Christ in Paul's life is what actually becomes evident. It is Christ in Paul that becomes evident to the entire palace guard. So it is by his life. Yes, it's by what he says. That's the furtherance of the gospel. But it's also simply by how he's living his life in the midst of a prison. Do we believe he's not caring for other prisoners? Do we believe he's not praying for the palace guards? Do we believe he's not being a pastor in the prison? We know he's pastoring the Philippian church from Rome 10 years later. He's continuing to do that. And so what becomes evident is Christ in Paul's life. And the second convicting question, is the life of Christ evident in my life? The third one in verse 14, and most of the brethren in the Lord, now these are brethren in the Lord, so they're believers, most of the brethren in the Lord, having become confident by my chains, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Paul's on the inside. He can't be on the outside in the streets of Rome preaching the gospel, showing people who Christ is. He's in prison, and by the way, he's still doing the work in prison. But those that he was mentoring, those that he was discipling on the outside now have risen to the surface to actually begin to minister in Rome on the outside of the prison. So the third one that we see here is that Paul, by his life in prison, is actually encouraging others to live a life for Christ outside the prison. So the first thing we see is that there's this expansion of the gospel. The second we see is that there's this evidence of Christ in our lives. The third is this encouragement to others to live that life for Christ. The encouragement to others to expand the gospel and to have Christ's life evident within them. Most of the brethren, this is what's important to God. Most of the brethren in the Lord are now confident, encouraged by my being in prison. And the reason they're encouraged is that it has moved them to be more bold to speak the good news of Jesus Christ in the public square. By my example, they've become encouraged. And so we ask the third question. What does my life encourage others to do? Am I expanding the gospel? Is Christ evident in my life? And am I encouraging others in the pursuit of the important things of God? I know you were really wanting to come be incredibly convicted today.
Hurts so good.
That's wonderful. Now, Paul's going to take a step back and express this now from being inside the vacuum cleaner bag. He's now going to express these same three things again, but he's going to express them from the difficult place that he finds himself in. Listen to the first one. Verse 15. Some indeed preach Christ even from envy and strife, and some from goodwill. The former preach Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerely supposing to add affliction to my chains, but the latter out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and in this I rejoice, yes, and will rejoice. Now remember, go back to verse 11, where we saw that the result of this life in Christ, the result of this proving the important things of God, is that we see the fruits of righteousness. He's now going to describe out of these three things, the furtherance of the gospel, the expansion of the gospel, the evidence of Christ in our life, and the encouragement to others. He's now going to express three very specific fruits of righteousness. The first one is this. He says, some indeed preach Christ. So this is now the expansion of the gospel. Some are out there preaching Christ from envy and strife. Now, what he's talking about here is that Paul had the public square. He was the guy in Rome, and so now he's in prison. There are others who want to take Paul's place as the guy preaching Christ in the public square. That's a pretty cool thing, except that they're doing it for the wrong motive. Their motive is, I not only want Paul's position, I also want Paul's support. So this envy and strife, I'm envious of what Paul had, therefore I'm going to step into that role and take over Paul's position. That's going to give me that position, that's going to give me that support, that's going to give me that network of people. That's what I want. So I'm going to preach Christ in behalf of Paul to get that. But he says also, some then preach from goodwill. And he's going to go on to say they preach from goodwill and love. This is that agape, selfless, sacrificial love. The former preach Christ from selfish ambition. We're looking at a huge contrast here between selfishness and selflessness, which is the fruit he's exposing here. The first preach Christ from selfish ambition. They want to get something out of preaching Christ. They want an audience. They want a good pat on the back. They want Paul's position. They want the support. Not sincerely supposing to add affliction to my chains. In other words, when they do this, and they do this from the wrong motive, it really affects me here in prison. But the latter preach out of love. They preach out of this agape love. They preach out of this selfless love, knowing that I'm appointed for the defense of the gospel. That word defense is the Greek word that we get apologetics from. It's apologia. I am the one who is defending the gospel on the inside. I need people defending the gospel on the outside from the right motive. And that is for the sake of Christ, not for the sake of their own ambition.
Now, are you saying that they're wanting to add affliction to Paul?
He says, supposing. So that the affliction that they're adding to Paul is that they're preaching from the wrong motive, and that does add affliction to Paul. What he's really saying here is that what they're doing this from, the motive they're doing it from, is a selfish motive. And that selfish motive does add affliction to Paul. I don't think we can pull from the text that they are actually intending to hurt Paul in prison, but what they are doing is by their action, they're actually adding that affliction to him. So it's another compounding event on top of them doing this from the wrong motive.
But it doesn't seem logical to me that if they want the place of Paul and the audience of have that notoriety, don't they see what the result is? You're going to be in prison with Paul.
Possibly. That's a great point. Unless you understand the movement that Paul had created was a movement of establishing churches. It was a movement of people that when Paul preached, the crowd showed up. And if the crowd showed up and you're one who really wants the adulation of the crowd, you're going to go where the crowd is.
Well, that is just a watering down of the gospel as we see today. You know, I can remember when I was in college, the university professors said, one of the first things you need to do is to join a church, to further your ambitions.
Yeah.
Well, what is that but the same thing?
Yeah.
Well, my translation has it a little bit differently, where it says, where he's talking about that they are preaching out of their selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. So it almost sounds like he understands that there's more intent there than not, that they are trying to stir up trouble.
And that's possible.
Yeah.
But the trouble that you would have to see, how much trouble can they stir up for Paul who's in prison? They can't stir up a whole lot. He's already in prison. No, that's exactly right. He's not considering them false teachers. He's considering them teachers with a false motive. That you can be teaching, and he's going to say it here in just a minute. What he ultimately says in this thing is, I don't care what their motive is. Christ, the important thing is the expansion of the gospel. Christ is being preached. So you're exactly correct.
That's a good point. That's why he rejoices.
That's why he rejoices. Let's walk through this. So the latter preach out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. I defend the gospel here. They're defending the gospel there. I've trained them well. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. So what's the important thing?
Christ is preached.
Notice the important thing is not your motive.
Expansion of the gospel.
Now, look at the byproduct of the wrong motive. Paul is hurt, more affliction. We can say ultimately that the focal point is going to be on man, not on Christ. But out of this, Paul has one specific focal point, and that's Christ. Whether they preach out of pretense or whether they preach out of truth, Christ is preached, and this I will reach. Where is he again? Is there anything he can do to the guys outside preaching out of the wrong motive? No. Except, thank God that Christ is being preached by somebody. Now, so this is one of the first fruits. I'm going to put it this way. This is one of the first fruits that comes out, and it is the fruit of selflessness, that I selflessly expand the gospel. Because it's not about me. When I expand the gospel, it's not about me. It's about Christ. And Paul's point here is we should be expanding the gospel, not out of selfishness, but out of selflessness. The point Paul is making is have the right motive when you expand the gospel, but whatever your motive is, expand the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Love to tell this story. Years ago, I was part of an evangelistic organization out of Dallas. And I was in charge of a video training people how to share the gospel. And we're at the DART station in Plano, Texas, Dallas area rapid transit. The trains are going behind us. I'm sitting with a little laptop. I'm looking at the teleprompter. I'm trying to feed the lines to the talent who is in front of the camera. And this is just a couple of weeks post Katrina. And as we're doing this and we're recording video, there's a guy sitting off to the side back over here. Big coat. It's freezing cold, Dallas morning. And he's sitting on the curb, and I'm thinking he's waiting for a train. And the DART trains come every 15 minutes, which makes, by the way, recording around a DART station very difficult, because every 15 minutes you have to stop, wait for the train to go before you can record again. But it's a great place to set up. So every 15 minutes, he's still sitting on the curb, the trains are going by, and there's nothing happening. He's not moving. And about every 2 or 3 minutes, he does this. He's getting up, tiptoeing over, and looking over my shoulder at what I'm doing. Now, in my brain, I'm thinking this: would you leave me alone? I've got to get this video done. Would you leave me alone? Go get on your train. Quit bothering me. Excuse me, is that selfish or is that selfless? Finally, he has come over. This is probably 6 or 7 times, and I turned around to him and I said, "Can I help you?" He said, "Yeah, what are you doing?" Now, think about the irony of this. There's a guy coming over asking me what I'm doing as I'm developing a training video to teach others how to share the good news of Jesus Christ. So he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, we're actually doing a training video teaching people how to pray for others before sharing the good news of Jesus Christ with them." And then I looked at him and I said, "Would you like to know about Jesus?" He said, "Yes."
Oh, wow.
Yeah, felt about this small. I'm sitting here wanting him to go away. He's actually coming over, hearing the stuff we're talking about and wanting to know about Christ. I told the director and the talent, "Hang on just a minute. Let me go. I got to spend a few minutes with this guy." We shared. He trusted Christ right there. Come to find out, he's a Katrina survivor. His family is still in Houston. He is up in Dallas trying to find work in an apartment. The director and the talent go to the same church. They brought him in. They found him a job. They found him an apartment. And 2 weeks later, his family moved up and were rejoined with him. And that never would have happened. Yes. That never would have happened if I had said selfishly a third time, "Leave me alone."
Yeah.
The expansion of the gospel. Paul is telling us here, it's time to reach out. Paul is telling us here that we need to not look selfishly. We need to see the fruits of selflessness in our lives. And so when God brings somebody into our lives, "Leave me alone" is not the response. That's not what he's looking for. He's brought somebody into our lives. He's put us in a circumstance so that we can say, "God, what are you wanting me to do here?" Because I want to expand the gospel. The second one, look at verses 19 to 20. He says, "For I know that this will turn out for my deliverance through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, according to my earnest expectation and hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by my life or by my death." And let me explain to you what's going on here. Paul's in prison. He has no idea whether he's going to be released executed or stay to rot in a prison cell. He doesn't know. But notice what he says. To the Philippian church, he says, I know this will turn out for my deliverance. Now, he's talking about a physical deliverance from the circumstance he's in. And his deliverance is either going to be to release, deliverance to death, or deliverance to stay in that prison and continue to do the work that he's been called to do. It's the deliverance to one of those three things. And he says, I know that through your prayers and the supply of the Spirit, one of those is going to happen. I'm going to be delivered some way, somehow, either unto death, unto release, or to continue to do the things that I'm doing here. And then he says in verse 20, according to my earnest expectation and hope, that in nothing I shall be ashamed. Here's what he's saying. If I die, I do not want to bring shame to Christ if I die. I do not want to bring shame to Christ if I'm released. I do not want to bring shame to Christ if I'm still stuck in this prison. I will not be ashamed, but with all boldness as always, so now also Christ will be magnified. The evidence of Christ in my life will be the thing that people will see in me, whether I am released, whether I die, or whether I stay here. No matter my circumstance, and by the way, let's talk about those three circumstances. If he stays in prison, it's not a good place. If he dies, it's not a good place. If he gets released, for Paul, it's not a good place. There's not a whole lot of what we would say, yahoo, I'm going, yeah, I'm released, I get this, or yay. That's not what Paul is talking about here. He is saying that no matter what happens by my life or by my death, I want Christ to be magnified in me. I want people to see the evidence of Jesus Christ so clearly in my life that they will come to know him because the gospel will be expanded simply by how I attach myself to death or life. Whew. That's what's called sacrificial. I will sacrifice my life for Christ whether I die or whether I live. So the first fruit we see is selflessness. The second fruit we see is a sacrificial life. Now, he moves from here and he moves to verse 21. For to me to live is Christ and to die is gain. This is Paul's, if I was going to say there's one phrase that would define Paul's life, this was it. For me to live is Christ, to die is gain. And ladies, here's what I will tell you. This is the ultimate win-win scenario. And I'm going to share with you a very quick story. You may have heard, this is not a, I wish I had a better story for a ladies' audience. This is a wonderful story for a men's audience, but let me just tell you as a ladies' audience, you may have heard of the story of Black Hawk Down. Have you heard of that story? A Black Hawk helicopter goes down in the capital city of Mogadishu, Somalia, and the Rangers, the Army Rangers, are responsible for going in to rescue those because their motto is, we leave no man behind. There's a three vehicle Humvee group that's going into town, and they're going into town to capture Somalia rebels. The leader of this convoy is a guy by the name of Major Jeff Strucker. Jeff and I got to be very good friends. I brought him to Austin to speak a number of times. I brought him to Midland to speak a number of times, and his testimony is nothing short of miraculous. If you actually get the movie, which is a marvelous movie, but it's very difficult to watch, you'll see Jeff. They portray him actually as a sideline figure, but he was actually the commander of this 3 Humvee vehicle convoy that goes in. And they're going in to capture Somalia rebels. That was their charge. So these are 3 non-armor plated Humvees like you could go buy down at the local Humvee store. And they're going into town, they're going in to capture in this capital city Somalia rebels. What they don't know is that there's an ambush waiting for them. They head into town, and in his front convoy is him, his driver, and his best friend, who's the gunnery sergeant, the guy who sits up on top of the vehicle and shoots. And as they come into town to capture these rebels, he said the gunfire that erupted on either side of the street was more gunfire than he'd ever seen in his entire life. In fact, he said more people died from crossfire because there were that many people on both sides of the street shooting at their convoy. And in the course of them driving in, On this first reconnaissance into town, his best friend was killed. He was hit with a bullet, drops down into the convoy, and bleeds out in the back of the convoy. He calls to his entire 3-vehicle convoy and says, we need to retreat. They go back to base. When they get back to base, they hear that the Black Hawk helicopter has gone down. And his commanding officer comes to him and says, Stricker, you got to take your guys and go back in because we don't leave anybody else behind. And he said, I can't do that. This is a suicide mission. He's just come from the ambush. He knows what's going on. And his commanding officer said, we have no choice. You need to go back in. We need to go rescue those guys. You got to take your convoy in. So as he's thinking through this, preparing his men for this, a special ops guy comes up to him and says, Strucker, I need to tell you something. The emotional damage that will be placed upon your men if they have to get back in that Humvee with the remains of your best friend in the vehicle is something they won't live through. You need to go clean up the remains of your friend in the back of that Humvee. Mm-hmm. So he said, I am sitting here with a mop and a bucket, and I'm cleaning up the remains of my best friend in the back of this vehicle. And what comes to mind is my devotion that morning. And it's Jesus in the garden. And Jesus says, not my will. He says, Father, take this cup from me. And Strucker said to himself, that's exactly what I'm telling God. I don't want to do this. Take this cup from me. And he said, then I remember the second part. Not my will, but yours. And he said, I recognized the first thing, and that was that Christ did this for me. And then he said, all of a sudden it hit me, this is the best win-win scenario I could ever have in my entire life. If I go in there and I die, I get to see Jesus. If I go in there and I live, I get to go home and see my family and my wife. What better scenario could there be? And he said, just as he came to that realization, a 19-year-old gunnery sergeant comes up to him, and this is the guy who's going to replace his best friend. And he said, Sarge, we can't go do this. Well, he takes him aside and he shares Jesus in the garden. And the 19-year-old trusts Christ right there. Because he said, Sergeant, this is the best win-win scenario you could possibly have. If we go in and we die, guess where we're going to be? We'll be face to face with the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And if we don't, we get to go home. They made 15 runs from 9 o'clock at night to 9 o'clock the next morning, rescued all men, and he didn't lose another man in his unit.
Wow, awesome.
So here's what we ask. As he went through the win-win, and we look at this turning point in this passage, for me to live as Christ, to die as gain, the question is, do we truly understand the win-win scenario of living for Christ? Paul understood it, and he said, my whole being is about living for Christ now, because I recognize if I die, guess where I go? So is my life evident? Is Christ so evident in my life that I am not ashamed whether I live or whether I die? For me to live as Christ, to die as gain. Am I sacrificially living for Christ? Am I selfishly expanding the gospel? For me to live as Christ, to die as gain, the ultimate win-win scenario. And finally, he concludes this with this last section, which is the section on encouraging others. Listen to what he says. But if I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor. Boy, does he have a great perspective on his work on the earth? If I continue to live, it's going to mean more reward for me. There's going to be fruit for what I actually do. Yet, what I shall choose, I can't tell, for I'm hard-pressed. This is a tough decision. Between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better for me, nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. So for me to live as Christ, to die as gain, what he's really saying is, Philippian church, if I die, it'd be far better for me. I'd be out of prison, I'd be out of this, and I'd see Jesus face to face, and there's no better thing I can think of than that. However, let me encourage you with this. If I stay, if that's God's choice and I stay, it will be better for you. Because I can continue to minister with you, for you, through you. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. Verse 25, and being confident of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith. You see, what Paul was interested in the Philippian church was that their faith would grow, their joy would grow, that they would pursue the excellent things of God. And in pursuing those excellent things, we would see this abundant growth in their faith, this abundant growth in their walk, this abundant growth in their joy. Was the church in persecution? Yes. And he could still say, I want your faith and your joy to explode. And it's going to explode if you pursue the excellent things of God, if you pursue the expansion of the gospel, the evidence of Christ in your life, and the encouragement to others. And you pursue the fruits of selflessness, sacrifice, and in this particular case, the third fruit is servanthood. Because Paul is interested in serving the church. I know that I shall remain and continue with joy for you all, for that your joy in the faith, 26, that your rejoicing for me may be more abundant in Jesus Christ by my coming to you again. If I should come, our joy is going to be explosive because you'll know I'm out of prison. If I don't come, our joy can be explosive because you know where I'm going to be. So we get this beautiful, beautiful expression of the encouragement of others, the evidence of Christ in our life, and the expansion of the gospel. And by the way, what better way to encourage others than to have the evidence of Christ in your life and expand the gospel and let them see that? There's no better way to encourage others. So the question then becomes, am I being a servant? Am I encouraging others by my servanthood? I told you this was going to be convicting.
Encouraging.
So let me conclude with this. Paul tells us that pursuing excellence, pursuing the important things of God, even in difficult circumstances, is the best win-win scenario. Pursuing the excellent things of God and changing our perspective on what's going on around us to see that God is encouraging us to pursue the excellent things of His, expansion of the gospel, growing in the evidence of Christ in our lives, and encouraging others. And out of that, seeing the fruits of selflessness, sacrifice, and servanthood come to the front. When we get to chapter 2, verses 5 through 11, we're going to see the example of Christ in these three things. Then we're going to see the example of Paul in these three things. Then we're going to see the example of Timothy in these three things. And then we're going to see the example of Epaphroditus in these three things. We get the perfect example of Christ. We get the really good example of Paul. We get Timothy, who's kind of the white-collar worker, and we get Epaphroditus, who's the blue-collar worker. And what Paul's going to ultimately say is, these fruits, this view of selfless, sacrificial servant is for anyone, anywhere, anytime. Modeled for us by Christ. And we're going to see it in the lives of all of these other people as Paul lays out selfless, sacrificial servant, which, by the way, he's going to tell us is the mind of Christ. This is the mind of Christ. Imagine a place where everybody was focused on being a selfless, sacrificial servant. Imagine being a place where everybody was focused on the expansion of the gospel, the evidence of Christ in our lives, and the encouragement to others. You begin to see how Paul is shaping this around what the church should actually be. And this is what he's calling the church to. I want to leave you with this wonderful story. And I had some people do some research on this story. And I'm going to tell you the story as a story. Because there have been one or two people who have come to me and said, this is a myth. There have been others who have said, we've researched and this actually happened. But there was a particular 8-year-old boy, and I don't know whether this is true or not, but if Chuck Swindoll uses it as a story and tells us it's true, then I'm going to go, hey, this is a true story. There was an 8-year-old boy who hated to practice piano. Hated practicing piano. And in order to encourage him, his mother decided that she was going to take him to see one of the great pianists of the day, a guy by the name of Jan Paderewski. Jan Paderewski was this marvelous pianist. He could play anything, and he was playing at Carnegie Hall. So the mom was going to take this little 8-year-old boy to Carnegie Hall. As it happens, the night of the concert, they get all dressed up. They're sitting in their seats. The stage is dark except for this beautiful, gleaming black Steinway piano. And Paderewski's a little late coming out. And as an 8-year-old boy will have it, he gets a little antsy. And as he gets antsy, he begins to squirm in his seat. And as he begins to squirm in his seat, he's looking around for something to do, and he sees a beautiful, gleaming black Steinway piano on the stage. And he jumps out of his chair, and he runs up to the black Steinway piano, and he begins to play something that he hates, but that he's practiced. He starts to play chopsticks. On this gleaming black Carnegie Hall stage. And what we hear from the crowd is this: get him off the stage. Get that kid. Whose kid is that? Get him out of here. Well, Paderewski hears the noise that's going on, and with his bow tie still undone, no jacket on, he runs out onto the stage and he begins to assess the situation. Here's this little boy determined to play chopsticks. His mother is in absolute terror because he's disrupting the evening, and the maestro runs over to the bench, sits down, and doesn't tell him to stop, puts his arms around him, and begins to weave the most magnificent melody into his chopsticks. And while he's doing that, he's whispering to the boy, don't stop. Keep playing. Keep going on. The answer that we get to what do we do when we find ourselves sucked out of our confident, comfortable cage into the bag, the vacuum cleaner bag of life, is this: we are to pursue the excellent things of God. We are to expand the gospel. We're to look at the evidence of Christ in our lives, and we're to encourage others to expand the gospel and have Christ evident in their lives. This is what we're supposed to be about. And what God tells us is, watch me weave this fantastic, beautiful melody into your life. Because I'm going to tell you over and over again, don't stop. Don't quit. Don't stop. Questions? Thoughts?
Wow.
Convictions?
I have a,
Yes.
how, it's kind of been off limits to take the gospel in certain government facilities, schools, wherever, or so we understand. I mean, why aren't we doing it anyway and going to jail for it more?
There are people all over the world that are.
Yeah, but not so much in our neck of the woods, not in the USA. We're just watching.
That's what I said. This is very convicting,
Yeah.
and perhaps it is convicting enough that you feel today God is saying, why are you being quiet? I'm not saying that he is. I'm not saying that you are being quiet. But perhaps that's what he's asking us. And that's why I said what Paul is looking at here is he is saying these are the fruits of righteousness in your life, expanding the gospel, the evidence of that fruit in your life, and showing others the evidence of Christ in your life. You know one of the great ways to show the evidence of Christ in your life? And Paul says it in here. He says, rejoice, and again I say rejoice, even in the midst, and Paul's saying this from prison. What do you think is one of the ways those guards had their minds changed in Paul? He's in this horrible place, and yet he's rejoicing that he's there. He's rejoicing in the Lord. That's the evidence of Christ in his life. And he will say it in the beginning of chapter 3. He's going to say, go back to the basics. The first and foremost basic of all of this is rejoice in the Lord. Am I rejoicing in the Lord? Am I rejoicing in the Lord? Because guess what people see? They will see you rejoicing. What they're expecting is the opposite. But if they see rejoicing in the Lord from you, that is the evidence of Christ in your life. And they will see that. And it can begin to open the door to a spiritual conversation that can see the furtherance of the gospel. Great point. Other thoughts?
Well, that's what Christ taught us in the way to pray. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Absolutely.
Just a quick little story. There's a thing that's going on in our society where men don't know if they're men and women don't know if they're women, and all the different things that are going on. And so my daughter was saying, Mom, why are you so passionate about this? And I said, because I love God, and He's my Father. And she said, well, I just whatever, don't get it. And I said, well, just say that I'm really right about something, and everybody attacks me. I'm your mother, you love me, don't you? She's like, yeah. And I said, that's how I feel about my Father. I love Him, He's my first love. And I said, our society is attacking His truths. And I said, you don't know how deeply that hurts me because of my love for Him and His love for me. And she said, well, I never thought of it like that.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And make no mistake about it. We are under attack.
We are under attack.
But here's the interesting thing. Was Paul under attack?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet, what was his focus?
Christ.
Expansion of the gospel, evidence of Christ in my life, encouraging others. Those fruits, selfless, sacrificial servant, we're going to see over and over and over again. And what Paul is going to say is, this is the mind of Christ. This is what you pursue. Have the mind of Christ. And it starts there. Which again, I'll say it as we started this whole study today. If I am sitting here looking at my circumstances and I am saying, woe is me, God is saying, lift your head and look at pursue the important things of God. And the important things of God are, is He wanting to use my circumstance to further His gospel?
Yes.
Is He wanting to use my circumstance to explode Christ in my life, to make Him evident to others?
Yes.
Is He wanting to use my circumstance to encourage others?
Yes. Absolutely.
That is the pursuit of the excellent things of God. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
You see it? Are you convicted? Because I sure am. I'm sweating up here. Wow. Any other questions, thoughts?
I'd just like to give one thought. 26 years ago, the Lord took my 26-year-old daughter home. Before that, I would talk to people about Jesus, but kind of reluctantly. After she went to heaven, I could care less what people think of me. I tell everybody I come in contact with that the Lord opens the door about Jesus Christ, because it's coming. He's coming. And if they don't accept Him, they're not going. So, I mean, I'm talking about waitresses at restaurants. The other night I was out, and this lovely, tall, good-looking black boy and he looked so sweet. And I said, do you know Jesus Christ is your Savior? He said, yes, I do. I said, you're my brother in Christ. So, I mean, it's just a natural outpouring because of what's really important to me now is eternity.
You bet.
Not today and here and now, but what's coming.
Well, and let me put, that's a great word, Jane. If any of you are concerned about it, let me put this fine point to it. God's expectation of us is not that we will convert anybody.
Right.
Because, by the way, you and I don't have that power.
Right.
God's expectation of us is that we will have conversation and contact with people and allow Him to do the work.
Absolutely.
There was a great little book put out by a guy who was part of Athletes in Action years ago, and the book was called God's Space. And what he said is our responsibility is to create a space for God to work in. And if you think about it from that perspective, can I create a space with any relationship I've got? Can I create a space for God to begin to work with? Well, guess what that is? That's expansion of the gospel. And as I create that space, what wells up in me? Joy, the evidence of Christ. And as I do that, and other people see me creating that space, were you encouraged by Jane? Do we have the encouragement for others? These are, and Paul says it, even me sitting here in prison, I can tell you, pursue the important things of God, even in difficult circumstances. Pursue the important things. Lift your head up, change your perspective, and look at what God is calling me to do. Is He calling me to expand the gospel no matter where I am?
Absolutely.
Is He calling me to show off Christ? Is He calling me to encourage others? Yes. That's pursuing the important things of God. He's going to tell us this over and over and over again. Any other questions?
I would just like to ask everyone to please pray about a circumstance that I keep running into. Our church does homeless bags that include a Bible and miscellaneous things that they might need. And I have actually talked to people in different government entities here, one of which I'm on the board of, right? And trying to say, hey, let's see if we can use these to get people back into treatment, get people, and I know these people that are working there that have the caseworkers and all, that they are Christians. I know that for a fact, but they're scared to do that. So they asked, can we take the Bibles out? And I said, no, what you can do is say, would you like a Bible? The church is offering these to you. You can include it in that. And they finally called me back and said, we can't do that anymore because their leadership said absolutely not. So we need a little opening of the doors here because we know the answer. We know this is what will change lives. And it's not just one, it's two specific entities that I've tried this with. And even the director of one said, I think that's a great idea. We'll figure out a way to do it. And so I've called each month now for about 4 months. Are you ready for some more of these bags? I have them. I'm ready to pass them out to you. And they won't now even return my email or call. And so, I want the door to open. I want the door to open because I want our community to be transformed in that way.
Yeah. Well, in the same respect that's going on, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the recording off if everybody's okay.